This is just a little book review of Kevin B. Anderson's Marx at the Margins on Nationalism, Ethnicity, and Non-Western Societies by Marcel Stoetzler. It was published in Patterns of Prejudice in 2013. Um, I generally think that, never mind. Who cares what I think? Anyway, let's go. Just, here we go. Kevin B. Anderson has published an excellent and timely book under a title, though, that almost seems designed to belittle the importance of the material discussed, far from being marginal to either Marxist thinking or to the concerns of contemporary social theory. Marx at the Margins is centrally about the dynamics of capitalist modernity, the problems of progress and modernization, the role of colonialism for all of these, as well as the resistance to the latter. The title is somewhat misleading also in a second regard. While Marx's views of, quote, non-Western societies, end quote, and ethnicity, mostly of race, actually, are indeed important in this context, nationalism is discussed in the book mostly under the perspective of resistance to colonialism, not, however, comprehensively in its own right. From 1851 to 62, Marx worked continuously as the chief European correspondent for the New York Tribune, the most important American newspaper of the period. Since covering European politics, included commenting on colonial and world affairs, Marx was forced to study the existing literature on India, Java, Turkey, and Russia, the results of which study are documented in numerous notebooks or excerpts. Anderson's first chapter looks at Marx's journalistic work from this period as well as the related notebooks. The second chapter is mostly concerned with the question of whether there was any potential for revolution in Tsarist Russia, and how in this context the workers' movement should relate to the question of Polish statehood and nationalism. There are also a few pages on Chechens and Jews. Different from what the chapter's title, Russia and Poland, the relationship of national emancipation to revolution, seems to promise, Marx's position as presented by Anderson was not at all informed by any notion of, quote, national emancipation, end quote, but in strikingly realist terms reflected a power political concern with the central role of the Russian regime in the reactionary alliance that defeated the 1848-49 revolutions and determined their aftermath. One of the most interesting aspects here is how Marx reflected on the question of whether the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, which also implied the dissolution of the traditional village community, changed the prospects of revolution in Russia. The third chapter discusses Marx's writings on the American Civil War of 1861-5. Marx saw the Civil War as a social revolution that in turn was, quote, the harbinger of socialist revolutions to come, end quote. As Anderson emphasizes, his writings on the Civil War explored, quote, the intersections of class and race, end quote. Going beyond abolitionism, Marx appreciated, quote, African Americans as revolutionary subjects, end quote. Chapter 4 concerns another one of the issues that Marx was consistently passionate about, the decolonization of Ireland. He proposed English workers should actively fight for the dissolution of the forced union between the two countries, as the union's ending would not only trigger a social revolution in Ireland, and perhaps more importantly, unblock the process of social emancipation in England itself. Marx adds, however, that this social revolution would take place, quote, in backward forms, end quote. Chapter 5 is titled, titled From the Grundrisse to Capital, Multilinear Themes, is perhaps the most original and theoretically challenging section of the book, and together with the first chapter on colonialism and the final sixth chapter on late writings on non-Western and pre-capitalist societies, provides the larger conceptual framework in which the discussions of the other three chapters' principal topics, Russia, Poland, United States, Ireland, should be located. Anderson demonstrates that in his mature writings, Marx conceived of human history as multilinear. Neither is history pressed into a rigid theory of evolutionary, quote, stages, end quote, as in the works of Marx's liberal predecessors, nor is there a sense that all the world by necessity has to go through capitalist development in order to regain, equally necessarily, primitive communism in a higher form. For Marx, the latter does presuppose, though, the universal adoption of the positive achievements of capitalist civilization, such as modern technology, and Marx clearly sensed that only a combination of specific conditions, plus the right kind of revolution, could potentially have prevented some countries, such as Russia, from having to go down the capitalist pathway. Such revolutions did not occur, though, and in the present period no very large country or area, like Russia, characterized by any form of communal land ownership, exists anywhere. If, as Marx seems to have thought, humanity still in the 1860s had a slim chance of finding a shortcut to the, quote, alternative modernity, end quote, of modern communism without passing through capitalist modernity, it failed to take it. The principal merit of Anderson's book lies in making accessible and opening up for discussion a great wealth of material from Marx, including copious amounts of quoted primary text, bringing to light a highly complex and at times contradictory Marx. Less convincing are the conceptual framework and the Bildungsroman-style narrative within which Anderson tries to accommodate the material. Anderson proposes at various points that Marx started out from a, quote, Eurocentric, end quote, position that was still full of admiration, a kind of love-hate for capitalism's modernity. The chief exhibit here is the Communist Manifesto, but then, through political involvement and serious study, gradually emancipated himself from this limitation, lost all his youthful illusions about the benign side effects of capitalism and colonialism, learned how to love anti-colonial nationalisms, and even recognized that the, quote, Asian type, end quote, of village community, at least in Russia, was the basis not only of, quote, Oriental despotism, end quote, but also, potentially, a future communism. It seems more accurate, however, to maintain that Marx was unwavering in his commitment to modernity, although it was qualified and destabilized by his critique of the capitalist form of that modernity. A critique that in its early stages was surely less sophisticated but not necessarily less strong. Likewise, Marx always looked for and variously found forces that would contribute to the creation of that alternative form of modernity that would mean the return, in a, quote, higher form, end quote, of the communism out of which human history began. It is crucial in this context to note, as Anderson indeed does, that Marx points to the, quote, lack of social individuation, end quote, in the ancient village community, that he considered individuality an important source of social vitality, and that he is very much aware of the fact that, quote, collectivist forms of domination that minimized private property could also create very pronounced social hierarchies, end quote. Anderson correctly states, quote, always the dialectician, Marx followed Hegel in discerning dualities and contradictions within each social sphere, even that of egalitarian and communal pre-literate societies, end quote, which is indeed true of the early, the mature, and the late Marx. As he considered, quote, intercourse, end quote, in the widest sense, cultural exchange bound up with exchange of material wealth, leading to increased accumulation of knowledge and thus, quote, productivity, end quote, broadly conceived, essential to civilization, Marx was fundamentally opposed to any political or cultural project that would isolate this or that section of humanity from any others, hence his fundamental opposition to nationalism and protectionism. At the same time, this fundamental connection between, quote, intercourse, end quote, and developed civilization as conditions for an emancipated humanity might also be seen as the reason why Marx, although, quote, always the dialectician, end quote, occasionally sounded as if he welcomed colonialism, such as in some passages of the Manifesto and in the 1853 articles on India that Anderson discusses in the first chapter. Anderson gives an important hint hidden away in endnote 20 on page 257. Marx wrote in a letter to Engels of June 1853 that his use of the term, quote, revolution, end quote, to describe some of the effects of colonial rule was meant to be deliberately provocative. As part of a, quote, clandestine campaign, end quote, against the protectionist economist Henry Charles Carey, whose position the New York Tribune was touting. This note is the only hint at a crucial dimension that is missing in Anderson's book: Marx's principled rejection of economic nationalism, expressed most explicitly in his 1845 draft critique of Friedrich List, the most important follower of Carey, not only in Germany, and of huge relevance for anti- and post-colonial discourses all over the world, including, for example, Latin American, quote, dependency theory, end quote, and a number of related speeches on, or rather against, protectionism. Marx's later support of Irish protectionism, which Anderson reports, needs to be discussed in particular against the fact that Marx strongly rejected it for Germany and the United States. The quite rightly controversial acknowledgement that colonialism might have unintended positive emancipatory side effects might have been motivated not so much by, quote, Eurocentrism, end quote, but by anti-nationalism. That is, Marx's principled rejection of what is probably Europe's most successful political idea.